Welcome, bienvenue, welcome to Property Quorum, a number of property podcasts every week. This is one of the major ones, I would say. It's a bun fight, talking with experts such as Zara Olibokas, Silas Jaylees, Hamish McClay, and myself, the idiot in the purple hat. And what we do is we talk about various aspects of the property market and what we've noticed and perhaps give our opinions. Today's topic, young renters being rejected. Time to find landlords. It's also young buyers rejected. And we'll talk about that too. But Hamish, to kick us off, would you start, please?
I will indeed. And good morning to all of you. Interestingly enough, we had a conversation several weeks ago when we brought up the subject of vulnerable people and the challenges vulnerable people face in terms of getting into sort of property. Many of them actually need some kind of sort of social support. They can't necessarily manage on their own, and they sort of struggle. They struggle a bit to get into a particular property, and sometimes they're charged outlandish prices for actually sort of doing so. Now, we speak to a larger number of people, and included in that are some vulnerable people, because there are some youngsters who are looked after up to a certain age, and once they get to a certain age, they then have to fend for themselves, and they don't get the level of support that we're having up to the age of sort of 18, up to the age of sort of 21, and so it can be an absolute struggle. But we're also speaking about many sort of younger people who, because of the cost of rents, struggle. So people are getting into their own property, if you like, at a later age, and you've got people trying to save up for buying. Now, it has been suggested, and many of us are against the idea of just more and more regulation, because once you introduce regulation, there are various other things which actually sort of happen. But one of the struggles too with sort of regulation is the fact that is the fallout from the regulation you introduce is far better that people can actually resolve this issue. There must be a way when we actually sort of think about it, because the trouble is with younger people, they don't have experience of working, so they don't have that sort of long experience that landlords like them to actually sort of have. Send us send us a copy of your income over the last sort of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or whatever it happens to sort of be. They don't have that good record of credit, and there's so much which prevents them from getting into housing. And it's really asking a question: what can we actually do to help them? Because putting in regulation is not going to help the situation.
No, and as we've noticed so many times, Silas, it is all very well to waffle on about regulation, but then you've got to the welfare state or whatever's got to pay to police it, and that's yet another burden. What say you?
Well, I think what's becoming immediately obvious is that there seems to be a high propensity of own goals being scored in the quest to vilify landlords. And if you look at it from a landlord's perspective, most of them aren't big corporates. They are smaller individuals. They've maybe got 1 or 2 properties, maybe even a small portfolio if they've gone that far. They are taking a significant financial risk to provide that roof over somebody's house. And that risk needs to be balanced against reward. Now, the reward of a profitable business has already been removed for the sole trader. It's the only business, as far as I'm aware of, where you're taxed on your turnover, not your profit. So you, as a sole trader in the property world, you can't deduct your expenses, the largest one of which is your mortgage. So you're already at a loss to begin with. Secondly, you're then putting a tenant into the property who you expect to pay your rent every single month. And as long as that continues, all well and good. But the challenge we have now is that the youngsters aren't getting jobs, or the youth unemployment is at some of the highest levels we've ever seen. Very difficult for them to get the employment in the first place. They may lack a guarantor, and the landlord is now forced to not take that risk because Section 21 has now been abolished, or is in the process of being abolished. So they can't get the tenant out without probably 12, 18 months of a court wait to actually evict the tenant. So you've got to look at it from their perspective. Where's the reward weighted against all of this risk? And, whilst I have some sympathy that there are some rogue landlords, I've heard far more stories about rogue tenants trashing properties, not paying rent. There's even advice going around on forums now saying the court backlog is massive. Stop paying rent, save it up, negotiate a deal with the landlord before you get kicked out. It's not creating a cohesive or collaborative property market.
Zara, welcome to the show. Although I realise that renting is not really your bag, you are only too painfully aware, are you not, of the difficulty that young people have of getting on the property ladder of any kind. It's as prohibitive in all ways. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, young people are being priced out of the property market, and not only that, it's, what they're telling me they can afford is only a leasehold flat. And, I'm sort of saying, be careful when you jump into buying a leasehold flat, because it's not all hunky-dory. You've got to pay for maintenance and repair, and the service charges are you're signing up to be a blank checkbook, which they will end up losing their properties. And I've heard stories of, people who've bought into the shared ownership scheme who've had to, declare themselves bankrupt and hand back the keys to the landlord, because they simply can't afford the service charges.
Yeah, and service charges seem to be a license to print money at the moment.
Yeah, the downward leasehold gang thinks it's going to be easier under common hold. But, maintenance and repair of the building doesn't go away. You're still going to have to try and organise people to do that. And there's less and less, tradespeople that know what they're doing that will do a good job. So you could still hire somebody and they could still botch the job, and then you've got to pay somebody again.
Hamish, this seems to be an intolerable scenario. We're being edged into generation rent, whether we like it or not.
Well, in some cases, yes. In some cases, unfortunately, the kind of generation rent we're going towards, instead of the private landlords that we're used to, and in actual fact, in many, many ways, because I believe it's up to about 80% of all properties are rented by private landlords, whereas you actually look at somewhere like Germany, it's significantly higher from the corporate side of things, and we're moving more and more towards the control of properties by corporate landlords who basically can afford to put up with the various sort of scenarios. So they're quite willing to accept certain sort of things. They have empty properties, all sorts of things. They will get behind on repair work. And unfortunately, the authorities, again, they need to regulate this. They don't want to upset those big corporate landlords, because they want to depend on those big corporate landlords to get more and more properties. So we've got, as you said, that we've got a very, very difficult thing. We rely on first-time buyers to keep the property market going, and we rely on landlords being able to buy these properties to put these younger people into. But the landlords aren't buying the properties. As Zara quite rightly explains, there's some of these properties that seem to be a good value proposition are in fact exactly the opposite. And
we just had a lovely comment from Christine, a friend of the show. That is exactly what happened to my uncle. They bought a property to rent out, help towards their pension, nearly a year of horrendous stress where they stopped paying the rent. Completely ruined the property. Nobody helped them. They protected the tenants instead. Hamish said this is intolerable.
Well, it's the situation that Silas actually spoke towards it. There's the type of protection which is being afforded is in the wrong sort of direction. But there's pushing all the time, and we know, I think, one of the worst scenarios, and it's not for the first time, many people advised by their councils, hey, look, stay there. Wait till you get that eviction order. Wait until the bailiffs turn up on the door, because we can't help you. And
wow.
Therefore, and it's exactly the same kind of thing as Zara was explaining earlier. The number of people who are going to lose ownership like in fact Christine's sort of uncle. Well, it's not quite the sort of same in their case, but what are the people that the unfortunate thing about those particular sort of people, they actually trash the property. That might not necessarily be the case. They might be perfectly reasonable tenants who, because of the cost of living, they just cannot afford to continue living there because of the actual costs. Because it's a shared ownership thing, they have to pay for the full cost, as Zara sort of explained on so many occasions. And basically, they are the ones that really don't have the money to be able to actually sort of proceed. If you like, carrying on sort of paying is some of these exorbitant sort of costs, not the rent. The rent they can just about scrape to, but when you put in those service charges, they have got a serious sort of situation there. What actually happens? If you like, the landlord will lose the property. The big corporate will move in, buy up these properties. A great, because at a loss to the actual original owner, the corporate gets hold of it, and it basically we start enjoying in this particular sort of type of system where we have corporate landlords and many of them who do not look after properties as effectively as do private landlords.
All right, I'm going to come back to it in a minute. But Zara, I suddenly thought, I read a stat the other day that's saying that a few years ago, it was thought that people moved house fairly, or reasonably. Now, the amount of time people are destined to stay in a house could be in years.
Yeah, I've got a client who was telling me this morning she hasn't moved house for 26 years.
And this is becoming more of the norm. Whereas, but like 10 years ago, you talk about people, I'm going to flip this house, get a bigger, better one, redo the kitchen, then sell that. And you just don't hear about that so much anymore.
No, and it's a shame because it's, I think buyers are wisening up to the traps that have been set. And I think this again goes back to the way that the conveyancing is set up and done by the developers. There's so much more that needs to be done to buy a house, to sell a house, and that's more difficult, as Silas is saying, to rent out a property. And you just don't know. Going back, we ourselves fancied ourselves as a landlord, so we bought us a second house and rented out the house that we were living in, which was a 2-bedroom Victorian house.
Right.
Lovely new carpets, lovely new kitchen, and the tenants trashed the joint, and there was cigarette butts everywhere all over the carpet.
Oh, God.
And so, we felt we had no choice but to sell it because the tenant wasn't paying her rent, but we were paying the 2 mortgages at the same time, and it just wasn't doable. So it's that kind of consideration, but also think about all those people that are stuck in flats they can't sell. They've also chosen to rent it out so that somebody's living there. They're still having to pay all these service charges, and they might not be making a profit, but they've got no other choice but to rent it out because the flat can't be sold.
All right. Silas, Christine has just said banks have purchased substantial numbers of residential properties across the UK. She thinks it's the conflict of interest, considering they provide mortgages. But this is just a step on the ladder of generation corporate rent.
Well, Christine's absolutely right. And I think the challenge that it now awaits us, particularly for tenants, is that we have this brilliant business model. If you're a bank and all of a sudden you're able to outbid all of the first-time buyers, and all of your landlords are actually exiting the market. I mean, I read a statistic this week that said 48 billion in housing stock has been lost on the rental market alone because of the exodus of landlords moving out of the economy. You've got this situation where you're going to have big corporate landlords with big corporate legal teams where the tenant isn't going to be able to use ChatGPT to protect themselves from an eviction, because that's exactly the methodology that the banks are using to evict people from their own properties day in, day out anyway. So I see it as a very tragic set of circumstances that we're moving towards. However, there may be some light at the end of the tunnel. I was reading, I think it was probably 2 weeks ago, John Lewis have actually closed their property development program where they were going to do build to rent. and they found, which was a complete surprise to anybody outside of the property industry, of course, that who knew going from selling clothes to building and renting out housing units was a considerably expensive business model to try and run, and they found that it was unprofitable. So they've now canned that as a as an approach, which is good. Whether the same happens for things like BlackRock, Lloyd's Bank, I think honestly, the banks are in for a very choppy period coming soon. There is some concern around what is happening with BlackRock, whether or not it's solvent. I think is some of the concern that investors are now questioning on the basis that they can't.
Hang on. What do the French say when they get déjà vu?
Well, you only have to watch The Big Short, and then that movie is fantastic because it covers exactly what happened in 2007, 2008. The unraveling of the property market, and literally within 24 hours, they were reselling a very similar financial product into the market. And if you look behind the scenes, the number of the load of toxic debt that the banks are carrying is 10 times what it was before the 2008 crash. And that may well be it's the undoing of all of this. So hope is not all lost. But I do think what has backfired in the short term is there's less housing stock. Renting has become more expensive. Houses are still sky high in terms of value, and wages are not moving at the same level. So housing is unaffordable to first-time buyers, and it is unaffordable for renters. So, yeah, an interesting time ahead.
And on that bombshell, Hamish, would you care to wrap up for today, please?
Oh, worth mentioning that a lot of the work that is being carried out by a great colleague of ours, Stephen Day, who lives in Royal Artillery Quays, they've carried out his particular sort of team, and he's got quite a significant team. In fact, Zara joins them on occasions too, in the work that they're trying to do within the sort of government, within the sort of House of Lords. And we're getting a lot of interest in many, many respects relative to the cladding issue mainly. However, what is actually sort of happening, and it's due to the safety of these properties, but what is actually happening because of the state of the situation, and Silas suggested or indicated the direction we were actually sort of going, these banks were, because of the default of the number of owners, technically owners at this stage, which, as Zara explains to us, an awful lot of them are within the shared facility. The banks are going to have to pick up the ownership of these properties with all these defaults that are going to come through. And we're not speaking about a few million. We're not speaking about a few billion. We're speaking about multi-billions that the banks are going to have to carry. And if we think 2007 was something serious, now I'm not wanting to tell stories, something needs to be done. And what does need to happen, we need to get a flow of these properties. We need to get them marketable. We need to be able to get younger people in. We need to get first-time buyers in. We need to do something about the ridiculously high service charges are being paid, not just in flats, but those service charges also apply to houses. Something serious, but actually regulating it is not going to solve the issue. But we want our younger generation to be able to get into properties. We want these things to happen. We don't want the banks to sort of fall over, because it's going to benefit absolutely nobody. I mean, our economy is in a very bad, poor state at the moment. It's in a far worse state than it was in 2007, when we could in part actually carry the situation. We won't be able to if it's allowed to actually sort of fall over the way it's going.
Well, look, thank you all for taking part in today's Property Quorum. Remember, this is a series of property podcasts that go across the entire week, starting on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So there's one tomorrow called Cladding Matters. Please do come along to that, 1 o'clock. Well, until next time, please keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and hopefully we will all look after each other's mental health. Until next week, bye-bye.
Bye.